Okay, so welcome everybody. So happy to see everybody. It's a true pleasure. There was a fellow who went to his rabbi. He said, Rabbi, I need your help. I don't know what to do. So Rabbi said, what's the matter? What's wrong? He said, Rabbi, my wife is trying to poison me. He says, you serious? He says, yeah. First it was with cyanide, then arsenic. So I'm telling you, she's trying to poison me. I'm lucky to be alive. I don't know what I'm going to do. She's really trying to poison me. So Rabbi said, you know what? Bring her to me. I'm going to speak to her. So one day he brings her over, and she goes to the Rabbi's office. And the guy's waiting outside, the husband. And half an hour, an hour and a half, 2 hours, 3 hours. The Rabbi walks out, and he turns to the husband says, Rabbi, what do you say? And the Rabbi looked at him, and the Rabbi said, oh, he says, take the poison. Take the poison. So I want to ask you a question. All right, this week's parsha, so it tells us about Yaakov Avinu, Jacob, and he wasn't married to one woman, he was married to 4 women. All right? A few questions here that we have to tackle. First of all, how is he allowed to be married to more than one woman? If you look in Genesis and Bereshis, Torah says, Al Kain Yazav Isha Esav Vesimo, and therefore a man shall leave his parental supervision, he shall leave his home, his nurture, and his nature, V'davak B'ishto, and he should cleave to his wife, V'hoyu L'basar Echad, and they should become of one flesh. That's the Torah prescription for marriage, that a man and woman, the definition is becoming one flesh, L'basar Echad, becoming fused together, amalgamated together, becoming one entity. One entity seems to be to the exclusion of anyone else, which seems to indicate that polygamy would be prohibited. A total proscription and prohibition on polygamy means it would be a transgression, seemingly. By the way, in Judaism, we define mathematics. In mathematics, 1 plus 1 equals 2. It's not a trick question. 1 plus 1 equals 2. In Judaism, we say that 1 plus 1 equals 1. Because you take a male and a female, you bring them together in marriage, they're supposed to become one entity. And the reason for that is that it's really not defined mathematics. It's because a male and a female, in order to have a successful marriage, they have to view themselves as not a whole entity, but as each being a part, a half. They have to learn how to compromise, they have to learn how to sacrifice, they have to learn how to capitulate, they have to learn how to concede, they have to learn how to accommodate, how to allow someone else into their lives, and how to rise above the occasion. And therefore, they're not one. The Torah says in the Talmud and Yevamos, tract the Yevamos, Hashari below Isha, somebody that dwells without a woman, it means that not that he's living with her in sin, he's not living with her in, let's say, wedlock type of relationship, but it says that a person that's not married, in the Torah law, Shari below Isha, Shari below Simcha, he's living without a wall. Wall means a fortress, it means for support. Shari below Simcha, he's living without happiness. True happiness is when a person is living within the parameters and domain of a Torah marriage. So, the Basar Echad seems to indicate, being one flesh, seems to indicate that the couple, according to the law, according to God, should be one. So how does Jacob marry, how does Yaakov Avinu marry 4 wives? That's A. B. Elsewhere in the Torah, this is in the book of Leviticus and Sefer Vayikra, if you follow the stone chumash, it's on page 652. Better be there because that's what, okay. So it says like this, it speaks about all the prohibited relationships called erva. Erva means the relationships that God doesn't allow for whatever the reason. Some are statutes, some we can't understand, some we could easily fathom why. And it says there In chapter 18, it's Perek Yud Ches. It says in Pasuk Yud Ches, "V'isha elachosa lo sikach litzror legalos arvasa aleh b'chaya," which means that you should not marry two sisters. In their lifetime. So something is odd. Something doesn't make sense here.
Before the Torah was given.
Something doesn't make sense. Something doesn't make sense. We have a tradition that dates back to Parshas Tolos, last week's Torah reading, that says that Abraham, that he kept all the Torah. It says it explicitly. Whatever that means. It means that he was able to conceive of the Torah through divine inspiration. He kept it. The Torah that's going to be given one day, in the future, it says you're not allowed to marry two sisters. So the question is twofold. What was that? I'll give you some sushi. Yeah.
Let's grab a chair.
So the question is twofold. A, polygamy. How does Jacob marry 4 women? And second of all, Torah says, in Leviticus, Torah says you're not allowed to marry 2 sisters. And Jacob marries 2 sisters. He marries Rachel and Leah, or Leah and Rachel, depending upon which order you want to subscribe to. He marries 2 sisters. How is he allowed to do that? So I'd like to tackle the idea of polygamy for a moment. Is polygamy allowed? Is it not allowed? I better be careful what I say. Very, very controversial topic in some communities. Biblically speaking, there's nothing wrong with polygamy. That's biblically speaking. According to the strict law, there's nothing wrong with polygamy. A man is allowed to marry more than 1 woman. That's not the ideal. The ideal was, as we said, basar echad, that a male and female have to be fused together, amalgamated together as one entity, as one spiritual powerhouse. That's the ideal. That's the ideal state. That's what it's supposed to be. Now you tell me, 1 second. Abraham he was married to Sarah, but then he has a second wife. He only had that second wife because Sarah couldn't conceive, because she was infertile. So Sarah is the one that says, you'll build for me, because if you take my maid, then I own the maid, I've acquired the maid, and I have all the rights to the maid, so if I have a child through the maid, it's as if it's my child. If you study the Talmud, you rarely find any Talmudic personality that had more than 1 wife. It was not the ideal, by any stretch of the imagination. It was something that was done under extenuating circumstances if a man's wife could not conceive. Now, according to the law, by the way, the Talmud says that if a man is married for more than 10 years and his wife cannot give birth, by law he's supposed to divorce her, because he has to fulfill the commandment of being fruitful and multiply and having children. And there are those Rishonim and Achronim that say that that's limited to the fact that if the person lives in diaspora, if he lives in Chutz La'aretz, if he doesn't live in Israel, if he doesn't live in Eretz Yisrael. Some opinions say that if a person lives in Eretz Yisrael, the law would be different than the person living outside of Eretz Yisrael. However, it's very interesting to note that this halacha, many don't follow today, and they stay married to women, even though the woman cannot have children. And the reason for that is that the mental anguish of causing a person to break up with his beloved, with his, let's say, his high school sweetheart that he loves, or the woman that he proposed holy matrimony to, so that would cause itself a tremendous amount of pain, and would put them through an ordeal. And the law is that a person only has to fulfill a mitzvah commandment up to 1/5 of his assets. So for example, if a person decides to go to Africa on vacation and forgot his tefillin, his phylacteries, and he doesn't have them, if it would cost more than 1/5 of his assets to FedEx the tefillin to Africa, he would not have to pay that expense. So the Chasam Sofer and others want to say that not only is it a financial expenditure that's taken into account, but also a mental expenditure, something that would be considered to be strenuous and arduous, mentally stressful, mental anguish. And therefore, if a person would consider to be himself to be in terrible turmoil, that he would have to do a commandment, he would not have to do it because that would exceed, in some respects, the financial loss. And therefore, for a person to have to divorce a woman that he loves would be considered to be something that is beyond. And that's why many poskim say that there would be an exception that he would not have to do it. However, you see that in the case of Abraham, he married a second woman in order to fulfill the mitzvah of having children. And by Yaakov, Jacob, the only reason why he had a second wife is because he was duped. Because his father-in-law deceived him, like all good father-in-laws do. Right? And he played a trick on him. He beguiled him. And he told him, he says, "Oh, you want to marry Rachel? Sure, you can marry Rachel." And then, what does he know? Though on the wedding night, who is it? It's not her. It's someone else. It's her twin sister. It's Leah. Now, by the way, something very deep going on over here. Because even though he was within total permission to steal the blessings from his brother, right? His mother ordained it, his mother sanctioned it, his mother endorsed it, his mother said it's permitted, you should do it. But he tricked his father. And his father said, "Who are you?" And he pretended to be, who? His brother.
Measure for measure.
Measure for measure. Remember that story? He goes into his father, and his father says, his father's blind, his father can't see. His father touches him, and he is bedecked. He's wearing hairy clothing, so he should feel like his brother. The voices were very similar because they were twins. Some say they were in the same placenta during the pregnancy. Others say they were in different placentas. According to many opinions, they were identical twins, even though one was hairy and one wasn't hairy. So they had the same voice. And he betrayed his father's innocence. His father thought that it was Esau, but really it was Yaakov. Yes, he did it under the auspices of his mother, who was a prophetess, who said he should do it. But nevertheless, he caused his father pain. And his father yelled out. And his brother yelled out. Remember that? It says that he trembled. He quivered. He shook his brother. Was his brother evil? Yeah. But he still caused him pain. And therefore, he would have to suffer in turn. By the way, it's brought down from that Rizal. Something very deep. And that is that if you study the Purim story of the genocide of the Jews in Persia, the attempted genocide, remember what happened? So it says that Mordechai, the savior, the hero of the Jewish people, when he heard what was to befall his people, so it says that he screamed. The same exact language is used. Asaph screaming, you look at the phraseology, identical. And we know that the Torah, even when it comes to the prophets and the writings, there's no such thing as anything superfluous or extraneous. Everything is succinct, everything is brevity, concise, because every word is measured because it's God's word. And if you cross-reference, and there's one word that's identical to another word in the Torah, it means that there's a code there that it's waiting to be unraveled and decoded and deciphered. It's a code for you to tackle. It's a code for you to address. The fact that the same word is used, Arizal says that he was being punished. Because he went ahead. Mordechai was actually the reincarnation of none other than Jacob of Yaakov. And Yaakov caused his brother distress, caused him pain, and he made him tremble and shake and quiver and scream. And therefore, he would have to have the same reaction. Now, think about it now. You ready? When Yaakov is on his wedding night, and he thinks he's with his beloved, who he waits 7 years for. 7 years is a long time. Oh, it's really a long time. He worked 7 years for her. And he's at the wedding night. And he gets deceived. He says, "Who are you?" And she says, "It's me," but it's really not her. So 1 second. History is being rewritten. It's playing itself out again. Because he did that to his father. Now he gets it back. It's scary. We never get away with anything. Every action engenders a reaction. And every time we do something, there will be a consequence. There will be some kind of repercussion and ramification to our actions. We may not see it now. But there is no such thing as zero accountability. There is full accountability, and we will pay for the crime. We will have to suffer the consequences. It will haunt us. And that's why it's better to get things right the first time. To be very, very careful. But again, Yaakov had no intention of marrying more than one woman. His intention was to marry one person. When he was deceived, and he didn't get his Rachel, he had to then marry the second woman. He had to go marry Leah. He didn't have a choice. He had to marry Rachel rather, because he had Leah. He didn't have a choice. The other two women was because one couldn't conceive, so he had to take the maid, just like his grandfather did. And the story is basically repeating. But you see from here that polygamy was never ideal. It was never ideal. But for some reason, it was permitted in certain situations, circumstances. It was a necessary evil. Necessary evil. It had to be done in certain situations. Until the year 1000, approximately 1000 of the common era, there was a man whose name was Rabbi Gershom. To call him a man is belittling his status and stature, because he was a giant, a spiritual giant, a saint. Rabbi Gershom, he was known as Ma'or HaGola, which means the light of the diaspora. He was from the city in France called Metz, France. That's where he came from. And he was the one that was said about him. Rashi, who was actually 2 generations removed from him, said that he is the rabbi of all great teachers. That's how acclaimed he was. That's how renowned he was. That's how prominent he was. I want to tell you that Rabbi Gershom had a very, very interesting life. He moved to Pumbedisa in Babylonia, in Iraq, from France, where he studied under Rabbi Shri Ragon, the great Gaon. He became a goldsmith, then he became a doctor, and he was persecuted because he was a physician to the king, who was actually a Gentile, that made a libelous charge against him, like happens to all good Jews. Unfortunately, that's what happens. And he was thrown into a tower, locked in a tower, with no escape. There's a miraculous way how he escaped from it. Amazing story, how he was very, very ingenious, and how he used a beetle, some say a spider, and was able to get out of there. And when his nemesis, John, came looking for him, he wasn't there, he was already on the boat, but John went into the room that Rabbi Gershom was incarcerated in, looking for him, and he forgot that he left the key on the other side and locked himself in, and he starved to death. That was his punishment.
Measure for measure.
Yeah. Rabbi Gershom was a goldsmith, and the king actually asked him to replicate the throne of King Solomon. King Solomon had a golden throne, yet he had animals, and the animals were animated. They almost became alive. And he went ahead, and he was not able to do it out of gold because the king didn't have sufficient gold. He made it out of silver. And then this guy, another nemesis, another enemy of his, accused him of stealing from the king's silver. And he had to prove, based on volume and based on weights, that he did not take from the silver. He had a very, very interesting life. Rabbi Gershom Marigola, though, he actually is very interesting because his first wife, his first wife's name was Devorah. She actually couldn't have any children, and she begged him to take another wife. He was one that promulgated in around the year 1000 an edict against polygamy. He said that man is not allowed to take more than one wife because, again, according to Torah law, it was allowed. It was never an ideal, but it was allowed for a man to take another wife. And he said that I'm not going to allow it any longer. And this became something that was enforced throughout the Jewish world, except for a few obscure communities that were basically alienated from the rest of the Jewish world. But everyone, because of his stature, because he was so preeminent, everyone chose him as the greatest rabbi of the generation, and his word became law, and became ensconced in the law, and that it's absolutely forbidden for anybody to take another wife. And the Mordechai, if you look at the Mordechai in Ksuvas, Simon Reish Ein Aleph, he explains why. He says that the reason why there was a prescription against polygamy was for the benefit of the family unit. He says that it's more conducive when a man can only have one wife because it's more harmonious and it leads to less jealousy and strife. If you think about it, it makes sense. All right? If a man has multiple wives, then there's a lot of jealousy. All right? She says, gee, you got her the fur coat and you didn't get it for me, you know? She's driving the Maserati and I'm not driving the Maserati, you know? What's going on here? So we're going to have a lot of big problems here. So because of the competition and the jealousy, much more harmonious, much less strife and jealousy, and therefore for the benefit of the family, you have to understand, in Judaism there's nothing more sacred and sacrosanct than the family. Nothing. The family is the overarching, the greatest, most important asset to the Jewish people. Because the family is where people are nurtured, where values come from. And it's where values come from that is then propagated. And it is then transmitted to the next generation where you're building, hopefully, pristine, pure, moral, and ethical people. And it all starts in the family. There's nothing more holy. There's nothing more sacred. There's nothing more valuable than a family unit. And one has to put his full emphasis, his full heart and soul into building a family, into maintaining peace in a home. Something that's very, very, very critical. And something that not enough attention, unfortunately. Today, we live in a disposable generation where 1 out of 2 marriages end up in divorce. That's not what God wants. God wants us to live in homes that there's a male and a female, and there are children, and people are getting along, they're giving to one another, they're contributing to each other. That's God's ideal. That's what God wanted. And unfortunately, it's being corroded. And it's the decadent lifestyle now that's making us come up with the wrong moral choices. And the implications are horrible. Because it's denigrating humanity. And it's belittling humanity. So the Mordechai says that in order for us to preserve the harmony in a family, you only have one wife. Interesting that the Rashba says that the reason why there was a ban against polygamy was in order to protect women's rights. He says because it deters a man from being able to abuse his wife. Why? Because, think about it. If a man wants, he could say, well, you know, I don't like you. But I'm not going to go ahead, I'm not going to pay a mortgage to divorce you. You know, I'm not hiring a divorce lawyer. I'm not going to have to pay alimony and custody and all that stuff. You know, instead, I'm just going to leave you to the dogs. And I'm going to get another woman to satisfy me. So it says the Rashba that in order to protect women's rights, this is way before the women's suffrage movement, okay? This is what, again, God's ideal is one man to one woman. But God said special dispensations. Here we're saying that dispensations and exemptions could be taken advantage of. And therefore, Rabbi Gershom says, no more exceptions. We'll have to figure out other ways to work around a woman who's infertile, you know, who can't conceive. We'll figure it out. But the answer cannot be taking another wife. Because then, if you allow that, you allow one exception, then it opens up Pandora box for other exceptions, and a woman could potentially be abused. Because nothing then keeps the husband from endearing himself to her and for preserving the relationship, because she's dispensable then, in a way, without being dispensable. He doesn't even have to divorce her, but he could just take another woman on her account. And that's the Rajba. It's interesting because Maram Padva, he says that, very, very fascinating. He says that the same Rabbeinu Gershom, Meragolo, the same Rabbi Gershom, that forbade polygamy was the same one that said that there has to be a change in the divorce system in Judaism. Because until the time of Rabbeinu Gershom, somebody was allowed to divorce his wife forcibly. Means he doesn't like her anymore, so he gives her a get, he gives her this special document, this was a writ of divorce, and goodbye, she's... Now, it was never meant to be like that. Obviously, the Jewish laws of Jewish marriage, and we said this many times, and Maimonides says that you have to honor your wife more than you honor yourself. You have to love her like you love yourself, and honor her like you have to love her like you love yourself, and honor her more than you honor yourself. It means you have to put her on a pedestal, and you have to treat her with a reverence. You have to really show deference to her and respect to her. So, Rabbi Gershom came along, and Rabbi Gershom said that although technically a man was allowed to divorce his wife without asking her, obviously he has to, by the way, he's not just allowed to, just dispose of her. God forbid. You'd have to go ahead and pay her the full marriage contract, the ksuva, and take care of her for the rest of her life. But he was allowed to technically speaking, he was allowed to say goodbye to her without her free volition. And when Rabbeinu Gershom came along, Rabbi Gershom said, you're not allowed to do that anymore. So says Maram Padva that these two laws are connected. Anybody can figure out, based on some simple logic, how the two laws are connected. How the two laws are connected, that you're not allowed to forcibly divorce your wife, and also there's no polygamy.
People just divorce and got married over and over again.
What's that?
People divorce and got married over and over.
I mean, they would forcibly divorce
And just get married.
and just get married to another woman, right? So how does this help? How does it help?
And how I say that the Raja says women's rights.
No, but this is specific. It's specific that the two are connected. The two laws are connected.
I was thinking earlier that Yaakov Avinu was allowed also to, like Hashem.
But I'm saying, I'm specifically this question.
Just these two.
How are the two laws connected? Well, it's basically, as Daniel said, that it's ineffectual. Because if you go ahead and you allow a man to marry a second woman, then by saying that you can't divorce forcibly, it's not really helping anything, right? So he said that he had to make a double law. The first law is that you can't divorce forcibly. The second law is you can't marry a woman upon a woman, which safeguards, each law really safeguards the other. But there's actually other opinions why polygamy would be forbidden according to Judaism, according to Jewish law. The other opinion is that they were afraid that man would become poor. The more woman to support, the more bank accounts he's got to open, and the more mortgages he's got to take, and the more diamond rings he's got to buy, and the more human wigs he's got to furnish. Okay, Right, so we got a lot of problems here. So men were becoming destitute because they had to take care of. Now listen, you can't just, according to Torah law, you can't just marry a woman, you got to take care of the woman. It says in the Ksuba that you have to cherish her, you got to, listen, there's nothing like the Ksuba. The Ksuba is a marriage contract that every man that wants to get married, he's got to go ahead and he's got to make sure that it has to be signed by witnesses. And it says that I will, ani okir, eflach, afarnes, I'm going to sustain, I'm going to support, I'm going to cherish, I'm going to honor. How many women could you possibly cherish, honor, support? It doesn't work. He says, so if you're going to end up doing it, you're going to get destitute. You're going to become poverty-stricken. So that's another reason why, in order to this is protecting the man. Protecting the man against his own, against his own temptations, against his own problems, causing his own problems. But there's yet another reason, a fascinating reason. And that is the reason that nobody has yet suggested, nobody thought of yet. Very fascinating reason, and it's called, in fancy English, consanguinity. And basically, let's say the guy goes ahead and he marries one woman in Brooklyn, and then he goes to San Diego and he marries another woman in San Diego. So he has one wife here and one wife there. They both have children, right? But the child that he has in Brooklyn never finds out about the child that he had from San Diego. One day, somebody's going on JWed or JDate or from one of these websites, and and he looks at this profile, and he says, "Gee, it really resonates with me. This profile, the person sounds so compatible." He says, "I have to meet her." And then he meets her, and there's something that talks to him. He feels like we know. They feel like, gee, we feel like we know each other for 100 years. And they're wondering why they feel so comfortable one with the other. And it turns out because they're blood relatives, and that would be incest. Right? It's a tremendous insert. So presumably he kept them all local.
Didn't say he traveled?
Yeah. Or he had IDs emblazoned on their heads that say King Solomon, right? Interesting because he's raising a point that King Solomon did have multiple wives, and the reason why King Solomon had multiple wives, he did it, L'Shem Shemaim, he did it for the sake of heaven, in order to forge alliances. He was the leading monarch of his time, he reigned supreme, and in order for him to be able to be the autocrat that he was, but also to be able to, not only he wasn't really an autocrat, because he was a peaceful monarch. It may sound like a little oxymoron, but he actually forged alliances with every leading nation, and he converted the woman. It's very interesting. But this is a fascinating concern, that if you allow a man to marry multiple wives, then one day there may be a terrible issur that results. And that's why, by the way, when it came to the Shiloh about artificial insemination, which is called, in abbreviated terminology, it's AI, right?
Not AI,
That's artificial intelligence.
IVF.
No, that's in vitro fertilization. I'm not talking about in vitro fertilization. So, artificial insemination, it was a big problem because, let's say, if a man who's impotent, not impudent, but impotent, he can't have a child. So the idea was that you have a bank, right? And the woman would get from a bank, and she would get impregnated, and everything would be great, and she'll be able to have a child. But it became a tremendous dilemma and conundrum, because first of all, is that considered to be adultery? Many different shilohs halachically whether it should be allowed. Is it considered, with the fact that she's being impregnated in an unnatural way, in a very unconventional, unorthodox way? Unorthodox, I don't mean as far as religion-wise. I mean it's something that's very atypical, and something that is really a little provocative, to say the least. But is that considered to be adultery? A woman is never allowed to have relations with anybody other than her husband, obviously. Actually, it's very interesting because the Talmud speaks about, you say, well, how would the Talmud know this thousands of years ago? Yet the Talmud speaks about cases like this. The Talmud speaks about a case of a woman that went into a mikveh and she became pregnant because somebody had been in the mikveh before that. And there's the famous case of Ben Sira. And so the Talmud does speak about such situations. In the Torah this week, the Torah portion this week speaks about genetic engineering, where Yaakov was able to go ahead and have a tremendous population of sheep that he did through genetic engineering. The Torah also, there's many references to genetic testing, believe it or not. But back to the case of the artificial insemination, one of the chief risks of artificial insemination, the problem is that there may be another person floating around that also was a child of the donor, and then these two children may meet up one day at college. They may be both, because they have similar DNA, they may have great intellect and be in Ivy League and meet up at Harvard one day, although I don't think the guy that's donating to the bank, I don't know if he'd really be usually it's not, but exactly that type. But anyhow, it's a very big problem. And therefore there was a heated machlokas between actually the Satmar Rebbe and Rav Moshe Feinstein. That became a huge controversy. It almost became physical, almost violence, because he's talking about, remember, there's nothing more sacred, there's nothing more paramount, and there's nothing more holy than the Jewish family. And this is our legacy. This is our heritage. So if something is going to impact, if something is going to interfere with the holiness and the preservation of the Jewish family, then obviously it's extremely serious. And if there's a leniency that is proposed, and that leniency could lead to a terrible disaster, then we want to safeguard it. So if somebody's going to say, well, it's okay to have such a situation, but that situation may lead to another situation where you could have incest one day because a brother and a sister may meet up that don't know they're brothers and sisters, and they're really estranged relatives, we got big problems going on. So you'll say, well, statistically, what is the chance of it happening? And therefore, you may say, and the great rabbi may say, he may rule that if the statistics are so minute, then maybe the ability to propagate, to have a family, outweighs that. It's a major consideration. And that's why, one of the reasons why polygamy was forbade. Not that a man should be traveling, the most important thing was for a man to be domesticated. A man should be at home as much as possible, but back then a lot of commerce and a lot of business was conducted in the sea, away from home, but that's not the ideal. The ideal is v'hayu l'basar echad, is that they have to be one flesh. They have to be together, building a home together, building a love life together that is full of reyes, ahava v'reyes. One of the brachas we make in Shabbat brachas is that the couple should be full of love. For reyes means that they should have a friendship. They should be best friends. A couple should be best friends with each other. And that's something very, very important. When you're looking for somebody that you want to marry, you have to say, first of all, am I physically compatible? Physically compatible means is there basic chemistry here. But more importantly, are you spiritually compatible? Do you jive together spiritually? Is this your spiritual soulmate? You have to be a spiritual soulmate. And after you determine if you're a spiritual soulmate, you say, are we best friends? Can we share together? Can we cultivate and develop a bond together where we become one flesh, where we become one together, where 1 + 1 = 1, where we feel each other's joys, where we feel each other's pains, where we're building something together that is not limited to us, but something that's great and grand. That's what the Jewish marriage is. So again, just to sum up that part of the class, is that polygamy according to Torah is not prohibited, but is not in any way recommended or suggested, and is only a necessary evil and under extenuating circumstances. However, when it is allowed, it was only allowed up to the year 1000 until Rabbi Gershom came along. Rabbi Gershom prohibited it in the year 1000. The question is, how long did he prohibit it for? Some say he prohibited for millennia, which means that would have expired in the year 2000, 1,000 years. Others say that it meant the next Jewish millennia, which coincided with the year 1340, because that's when the year 5000, if I'm not mistaken, began. If I'm not mistaken, I may be off in the numbers. Okay. There's a lot of debate. Others say it continues until Mashiach comes. Okay, so I don't want anybody to get any ideas in their heads. For all intents and purposes, it continues until Mashiach comes. Okay. Now, how do we deal with the problem that Yaakov married 2 sisters? How is he allowed to do that?
He was a Gibur of Adam HaRishon. He also had 2 Chagas.
So it's interesting. How is he allowed to do it? According to Torah law, how is he allowed to do it? So I want to share with you something amazing, what the Maharsha says. This Maharsha you can find in Yuma, Mesachos Yuma, if I'm not mistaken, I think it's Daf Chav Ches. Maharsha says something fascinating. He says that Rachel and Leah, Rachel and Leah, the daughters of Lavan, they weren't Jewish. In order to marry Yaakov, they had to convert to Judaism. They were Nashim Nachrios. They were strangers. It means they were strangers to Judaism. So therefore, when a person converts to Judaism, the Talmud says, Gerish and Iskayr, a convert that becomes Jewish, Kekon Shnoadomi, they are born again. That's where the Christians get born again from, okay? That's where it comes from. They are born again. It means that they go through a total metamorphosis. And it's like almost like a transmigration of souls. You have a new entity, and therefore, since it's a new entity, therefore, what happened is, you know what happened? They're new people.
They're not related.
And they're not related. They are not considered to be blood sisters anymore. Legally, according to halacha, they're not related at all. And since they're not related at all, technically, if a brother and a sister both convert to Judaism, they're not considered to be related. And technically speaking, according to the letter of the law, technically speaking, they'd be allowed to marry one another. However, because it doesn't look good in the public eye, and people will misconstrue and misinterpret things, therefore they're not allowed to get married to one another. They're not allowed to get married to one another. According to halacha, the halacha would say they're not allowed to get married to one another. So it says to Maharsha that he was allowed to marry them because halachically, legally, they weren't considered to be two sisters. Wow. They weren't considered to be two sisters. As a matter of fact, this statement that when a person converts, they consider it to be a new entity, had a lot of halachic implications. For example, if a person was deemed to be, for let's say, a child needed a circumcision, and the child cannot have a circumcision because he's a hemophiliac. Hemophiliac means that you extract blood from him, he will bleed to death. He doesn't have the coagulant agents, let's say prothrombin or vitamin K. So he'd hemorrhage. So if you do a bris on him, you circumcise him, he bleeds to death. So he can't have a bris. And the law is that if two children in the family are hemophiliacs, the third child is not allowed to get a bris. Because that already considered a chazaka. When it comes to danger, we say after two, it's already considered a presumption that this is the status. So let's say you have two babies that both underwent a circumcision as Gentiles. Gentiles. And then the family converts to Judaism, and now the child is a Jew. The third child, is he allowed to get a bris milah? He's not considered to be related to those two anymore. You hear? Chasam Sofer's question.
Is he still risking his life?
So no, when you convert, it's not only a spiritual transformation, it's a physical transformation. You're a new entity. So that's a question. Just a question, just pointing out, okay? So these two sisters, Rachel and Leah, Rachel and Leah, are considered to be strangers. And that's why he's allowed to marry two strangers. The Orach Chaim HaKadosh says something very interesting. The Orach Chaim HaKadosh says that Gentiles only have to keep 7 laws of Noah. A Jew has to keep many more mitzvahs. He says the patriarchs and matriarchs, they accepted upon themselves the Torah. The Avos and Imos accepted upon themselves the Torah, but they did it according to how they saw fit. But if there's something that they saw, if they were able to divine, if they were able to perceive that there was a specific need for them to take another mitzvah or do something different, then they were allowed to do it. Yaakov Avinu saw that from these two women, he would build Klal Yisrael, the nation of Israel. And therefore, even though he, generally speaking, kept various commandments, over here, he had a premonition. He had an intuition. He had a drive that motivated and told him, you have to get married to these two sisters. And therefore, he wasn't bidden to keep that extra commandment. He was bidden to keep the 7 laws of Noah, but not more than that. Because he saw there was something exceedingly special and spectacular about these two girls, and therefore he was allowed to go ahead and pass judgment and skip that mitzvah. That's Orach Chaim HaKadosh. Nachmanides, Ramban, and Rashba say that the Avos only kept the Torah in Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel. Outside of Israel, the diaspora, they did not have to keep the Torah. And since he was living in Iraq at the time, when he married the two sisters, he was allowed to marry the two sisters because he wasn't living in Eretz Yisrael. That's how the Rashba and the Ramban learn up, that as long as he was living outside in Chutz La'aretz, it was okay to marry two sisters. And that's where the Ramban, Nachmanides, explains the tragedy unfolds, where Justice is about to finally go home after 22 years. So many years, right? Of not seeing his parents. What happens? He's at the brink of entering Eretz Yisrael, and Rachel dies. Ramban explains, Rachel has to die, because he can't go into Eretz Yisrael being married to two sisters. It was all part of the scheme.
Why is the young one dying?
Because she was the second one that he married.
Because she's a loved one?
So it's just, yeah. Other Mefarshim say that he was allowed to marry two sisters because the reason why the Torah gives a reason why you're not allowed to marry two sisters, it says they will be tsaros. Not from the word tsurus. And tsurus meaning like, pain. Tsurus meaning adversaries, combatants. Because when you have two women living in the same roof with the same husband, they each could have wanted his attention. They each could have wanted him, to spend time. So therefore, he's going to have issues, he's going to have problems. Yaakov said, 1 second, these two sisters, they're not like average sisters. Because what? When I went ahead and I thought on my wedding night that it was one sister, the other sister went ahead and accommodated and gave her the signs in order not to humiliate and embarrass her. So these two sisters will never be combatants. They'll never be adversaries. And therefore, there's an exception. So he was able to conceive the reason for the Torah, and he was able to say, this is an exception to the rule. Now, I want to share with you a very, very deep reason. Yeah.
Even though that Leah, so she felt hated.
She felt hated, yeah.
In comparison.
Right, in comparison, yeah. In comparison, right. Now, you have to hear this. Arizal. Arizal sets forth a fundamental, really a foundation. This is what Arizal says. Arizal says, Moshe, listen. Moshe, listen what Arizal says. He says something amazing, really astounding. He says that if you study the relationships in the Torah, the ones that really had the greatest societal impact, and those that had the biggest significance, something was wishy-washy in all these relationships. Something was almost perverse in these relationships. You study the relationship of Mashiach's ancestor, Rus. Rus comes from Moab, who comes from Lot with his two daughters, with his daughter in the cave. You study Yehuda, who's again the ancestor of Mashiach, and Yehuda with Tamar together, where he thought that she was a prostitute initially. What's going on here? What's this all about? You study all the relationships, and something looks amiss, something looks suspect, something looks perverse, something looks distorted, something looks very, very unholy. Says Arizal that when something great is about to transpire, there's a fight in heaven. The prosecuting agent, the prosecuting angel, tries in every which way to corrupt and to prevent it from unfolding. And therefore, this relationship has to happen where it looks like it's under the radar. It looks like something's wrong. And therefore, he doesn't pay attention to it. It's because something great can't be coming from that. And that's why Yaakov married two sisters according to Arizal. Because these two sisters are building the Jewish home. They're building Judaism. They're building the Jewish nation. How does it happen? It happens in a way that looks suspicious. It looks corrupt. Because from this is become the Jewish greatness. That's how Arizal explains. And therefore, the Satan the Kitrug, the Mekatreg, doesn't even pay attention. He can't imagine, he can't conceive that greatness is coming from this. And it means that we can relate to this so well. Because we're in the time now where we're going to see Mashiach very soon. Very, very soon.
How so?
You see it happening. You see it transpiring. We're living in times that no one ever dreamt of. No one. Your great-great-grandparents, if they knew that there were Jews that were walking around chewing sesame seeds and sunflower seeds in Jerusalem and saying, you know, they'd say, what are you, crazy? The Jews are back in Jerusalem after thousands of years? It's impossible. That there's a Jewish army that's one of the best armies in the world? It's impossible. That you today could go ahead and visit Avram Avinu, your patriarch Abraham, in the cave of Maris HaMachpelah? It's impossible. That you could go and pray at the Western Wall? They'd say, you're ludicrous, you're preposterous, you're insane, you're demented. What are you smoking? What are you drinking? No Jew ever did that. You told my grandmother this? She'd say, what? Yet, I could get on the plane right now. In a few hours. In the grand scheme, it's a few hours. I could be at the Western Wall. Where it says about the Western Wall that it will never be destroyed. There's a prophecy. The entire temple's destroyed, but it says that God is Mashkiach, that God's watching, and that the Western Wall will never be, it's invincible. It's indomitable. You can never destroy it. You know how many dynasties, you know how many empires, you know how many emperors, you know how many armies try to destroy the Western Wall, and they can't? It says it will never, ever be destroyed. Try to send a nuke against it. This is a prophecy. Thousands of years already, it's never been repudiated, this prophecy. So you think it will be repudiated? I'm willing to say that this prophecy will never, ever be negated. Right? If for thousands of years already, no one's been successful in tearing it down, and will never be torn down. So we're living in spectacular. We're living in times now where the President of America said that the entire Israel, he already said it. He said the Golan is ours. He said Jerusalem is ours. He said Judea and Samaria is ours. Okay, I'm waiting for him to pronounce Gaza as ours, okay? Okay, well, it's coming, right? The man who everybody thinks is crazy, the man who is a pathological liar, according to most, he's the one that's rectifying all the wrongs and justifying all the, it's amazing. So what is this telling us? Who no one would ever suspect, because he looks so depraved, and he looks, this is the Arizal. It looks like it's all a charade. It looks like it's all some machination, wily scheme. But really, Hashem is now planting the seeds for the Geula, for the redemption. And you know what this means? That Mashiach, he doesn't maybe have to come from the most pristine. You know, don't give up on yourselves. Don't give up on yourselves, you know? You never know. You never know. You say, how could I be Mashiach? My father's and my mother. 1 second. Maybe Mashiach is going to come from the diamond in the rough. Maybe Mashiach is going to come from the least expected place. Remember, as long as the genealogy, as long as the pedigree comes from Judah, all the way back to King David and then Judah. I don't know what kind of situation, circumstance. Don't give up on yourself. Don't get a messianic complex here, okay? I've spent a lot of time in psychiatric centers, but not as a patient, okay? But I've spent a lot of time there, and I've met a lot of people who walk around saying that they're JC, you know, and that they're Messiah. You gotta believe it, maybe. Every person is a Mashiach. According to the Zohar, every person has a little, is gonna bring some kind of redemption to the world. But maybe you're gonna be the Mashiach. You never know. You never know. So remember, I'm gonna end now because we have another amazing class coming up from Rabbi Goodstein with delicious chont. But I just wanna tell you that remember, the ideal in the Torah is Basar Echad, is getting married to a woman that you could build an eternity with. A spiritual compatibility, your soulmate, that you could fuse together and become one with. And there's nothing more important in Judaism than the family togetherness, than family inclusiveness, and family harmony. Because family harmony, when there's peace in the home, and there's values in the home, that gives forth children that will be the Or L'Goyim, that will be the light into the nations, that will be the moral beacons, and that will pave the way to the time of utopia that we all wait for, the Geula Shalem, Amen. Thank you for listening, everybody.